case. We haven't been covering it every single day the way that we covered the criminal trial against George Floyd. So I think a lot of people have been missing different pieces of this. So we want to catch you up.
So let's back up to Memorial Day weekend of 2020. That's when the George Floyd incident occurred. Of course, we know how the criminal trial of Derek Chauvin went. He was convicted in his death of murder. Now, this is the federal civil rights trial. In essence, it says that these three officers, they were charged with denying George Floyd his civil rights by wantonly denying him medical care when that incident was occurring.
Yeah, this while their most senior officer on the scene, Derek Chauvin, pressed his knee into the neck of George Floyd for some 9.5 minutes as Floyd pleaded before going silent. Kueng and Thao. So let's talk about the officers involved here. J. Alexander Kueng, Thomas Lane, and Tou Thao are these three officers, former Minneapolis police officers who are charged with violating George Floyd's civil rights. Kueng and Thao are also charged with failing to intervene to stop Derek Chauvin on that incident. And if you remember, Tou Thao was there. I believe it was Tou Thao who was the one.
Yeah, he was in charge of controlling the crowd.
Right.
So if you think back to that video that we've all seen probably far too many times, you'll note that Tou Thao was on the street facing the bystanders, those that were recording the incident and were asking that they apply help to George Floyd. And in the center, then it was Derek Chauvin with his knee to the neck area of George Floyd. In the middle was J. Alexander Kueng and then Thomas Lane. And they both had the responsibilities of subduing and keeping George Floyd on the ground. The charge is that they should have been fully aware that George Floyd was expiring, that he was losing consciousness, that he didn't have a pulse, all the things that were occurring during that 9 minutes when he was prone on the ground there. And so the charge was, as I said before, it was a charge of denying George Floyd's civil rights. And one of those civil rights is due medical care, and they are charged in federal court of denying that. This has nothing to do yet with the criminal trial that these men are accused of for their part in George Floyd's death. That's a state trial, and that occurs later this year.
Our Paul Bloom covered that criminal trial extensively, was there in court for many days. He joins us now from our newsroom. So, Paul, we see a lot of similarities in these two trials in that we've seen some of the same witnesses taking the stand as we sit here waiting for this verdict, which is about to happen any moment now. Your thoughts as we head into the verdict?
Yeah, a couple important thoughts I have at the moment. One is obviously no video cameras are inside this federal courtroom, so we're sort of monitoring social media. Our colleague Rob Olson is in the courthouse, so this verdict a much different scenario than we saw in the state cases of Derek Chauvin, then of course more recently Kim Potter. So we're basically watching our phones right now for word from the federal courthouse. We got our bulletin at 3:45 telling us a verdict was 15 minutes away. So we're certainly past that. So my imagination at this point, my guess would be they are in court. The jury has come back. Something important to realize about this jury, it is a federal court. So these jurors come from all over the state of Minnesota. Several, of course, from the Hennepin, Ramsey County areas, but there are several jurors from outstate. And that certainly changes the dynamic here. This case, a lot different. Judge Paul Magnuson, who presided, limited the video evidence for the most part, limited emotional testimony. Pete Cahill in the state court allowing a lot of emotion in that courtroom. Judge Magnuson thought it would be too prejudicial, so he tried to keep out some of that emotion. He'd stop court if witnesses got very upset on the witness stand, not wanting to prejudice the jury as they think about the case. And of course, the big, huge difference here is Derek Chauvin, of course, the man kneeling on George Floyd's neck for some 9.5 minutes, is not in the courtroom. No doubt he loomed huge here. Two rookie officers. You think about Thomas Lane, Alexander Kueng, just 3 and 4 days onto their job as full-time Minneapolis police officers. They were your first two officers at the scene. And remember, this is a civil rights trial, that they deprived George Floyd of his civil rights. And what's interesting about this case, Amy and Randy, is they're depriving George Floyd of his civil rights, allegedly, by not doing something. So that's different than a typical criminal case where the defendants are on trial for doing something criminal. Here it's because of what they didn't do. They didn't intervene. They didn't push Chauvin off of George Floyd. They didn't, voice their opinions louder, more clearly than Thomas Lane did a couple of times. So the government here is asking this jury to convict these three men basically for violating civil rights by inaction. Of course, Tou Thao has said he never touched Floyd. He's doing crowd control, and the other two rookies very much deferring, at least in their testimony, to Derek Chauvin, the much more senior officer, and in one case, the training officer for Alexander Kueng.
Let's talk about that a little bit, Paul, and that was really the crux of the defense for those three officers. It was kind of twofold. One, that they had to defer to the senior officer on site, and that was a big part of this trial. But also the fact that several of them said, at least J. Alexander Kueng and Thomas Lane, Tou Thao said he was too far away to really see what was going on, but the other two said, listen, we were there, we felt that he was doing fine, our senior officer seemed to think he was doing fine. We were only following the lead of our senior officer, which at the time was Derek Chauvin.
Yeah, and Lane is down at the base of George Floyd's body, holding the legs and feet. He checks in with Derek Chauvin a couple of times. We see that on body camera footage. Hey, Derek, should we roll him over? Is he okay? They check his pulse, no pulse. We want to hold him over. You remember Lane saying something to the effect that I'm worried about excited delirium here. We've talked a lot about that controversial topic and the idea that these officers, thought perhaps at any moment George Floyd might come awake, and then they had dealt with the strength that he had in trying to arrest him. So I think huge factors in this case, not only the idea of rookie officers and Derek Chauvin being able to be blamed. Remember, he's already pleaded guilty in this case. He hasn't been sentenced yet. He was sentenced for his state conviction. But also on trial here very much MPD training. We talked about training, Kueng, particularly Lane, more recent, the rookies, how they were trained in stopping a fellow officer who might be acting inappropriately or who might be, applying excessive force. And what can you do? They basically explained it was a very militaristic type training program, and you defer to the senior officer, the man in charge or the officer in charge at the scene. And they very much felt that way. And then, of course, the controversy over this excited delirium and what they were so worried about in George Floyd and how they thought perhaps he could wake up at any moment, and that sort of guided their thinking in the field. So in their mind, an important legal term to keep in mind here is that they willfully deprived George Floyd of his civil rights. Their testimony came in that it wasn't willful. They just really didn't know any better, that's how they were trained to be officers in the streets, defending, protecting the city of Minneapolis. And that has been put on trial before this jury. And it will be interesting to see, if you agree that perhaps they were following all their training, then can you find them guilty of a crime? Question mark. We're probably just moments away now from learning from inside that federal courthouse in St. Paul as we await this verdict.
Yeah, Paul, I just wanted to remind our viewers that we are waiting for a verdict in the federal civil trial of three former Minneapolis police officers, J. Alexander Kueng, Tou Thao, and Thomas Lane. These were the three officers, in addition to Derek Chauvin, who were on the scene that day when George Floyd died. Rob Olson is a reporter who has been covering this every day. He's been at the courthouse in St. Paul. He's been tweeting just a little bit here as we wait. I don't know if we have a picture here, but we're waiting. What we're looking at is a podium outside. There are no cameras in the courtroom, so we're looking at a podium and we're waiting for comments to be made after that verdict is read. So I can tell you what our Rob Olson is tweeting right now. And this is a look at that podium shot. Reporters and photographers are getting their mic checks ready as we're told that verdicts will come down any moment now. Rob Olson said the jury deliberated a total of about 13 hours, 7 hours on Wednesday, and then another 6 today. He says no sign of activity yet in the courtroom or that live feed in the courthouse. As you can see, it's blank. Also, one more here. He says that as we are all seeing a live picture of the seal above the judge's bench during the trial, we saw 3 camera views and a split screen. The judge, also often just the aforementioned seal, the witness box, and the attorney who was questioning. That is all that they got to see.
And to sort of clear some of this up for our viewers, because we know that you're either joining us or have a hard time following what's going on in terms of the judicial system. Again, keep in mind this is one of two trials for these three former MPD officers. Remember, the criminal trial, the state trial, has not happened yet, where they are charged for their roles in George Floyd's death. We know that Derek Chauvin was convicted earlier last year in George Floyd's death of murder. He is now in federal prison. This trial is a civil rights trial. It is denying George Floyd an element of his civil rights. And these are the three officers, Tou Thao, J. Alexander Kueng, and Thomas Lane. So this is held in federal court. And this is slightly different than what will happen in criminal court. It's still a jury. There's still a judge. Judge Paul Magnuson oversees this case. But this is simply put denying George Floyd in this particular situation medical care to keep him alive during this incident.
All right, Randy, I just want to let you know here, Rob Olson is tweeting out that the judge is in. He was just handed the verdict forms. And our Rob Olson tweeting, Judge Magnuson has finished looking over the forms. Tou Thao, guilty of count 2 is what we have so far.
So this is happening right now, folks. Again, no cameras in the courtroom. So we will relay this information for individual defendants as they come down.
Tou Thao, guilty of count 3.
Now they'll move to the next defendant, probably J. Alexander Kueng.
And again, this is real time, this information coming into us. Here we go. J. Alexander Kueng, guilty on count 2.
Keep in mind, while you're thinking about this, each defendant had to be considered separately from the other defendants when this jury was deciding to either acquit or find guilty. Waiting on count 3 for...
Count 3, J. Alexander Kueng, guilty on count 3.
So just to summarize, Tou Thao guilty on both counts, J. Alexander Kueng guilty on both counts. Next is Thomas Lane. That's being considered right now. And again, each defendant is being looked at separately in this case. They were tried together. Much of the testimony was specific to each defendant, so that's why the jury had to consider charges for each defendant, because their roles were all slightly different in that incident.
And our Rob Olson covering this for us. Again, no cameras in the courtroom, so we are relying solely on the social media of our Rob Olson right now, waiting on
and you can see on your screen the details of those counts: depriving Floyd of his right to medical care, guilty; willfully failing to intervene, guilty. That's not stopping what they considered the senior officer, which was Derek Chauvin.
All right, Thomas Lane, only charged with count 3. Thomas Lane, guilty.
And he was willfully failing to intervene. That was the charge for Thomas Lane, which is count 3. So here you have it to summarize. Tou Thao guilty of counts 2 and 3, which was depriving Floyd of his medical care and willfully failing to intervene. Same exact guilty verdicts for J. Alexander Kueng. And then for Thomas Lane, he was only charged with count 3, which was depriving Floyd of his right to medical care. On that count, he is also guilty.
All right, let's go now to our Paul Bloom back in our newsroom. Paul, your thoughts as we're reading these verdicts?
I mean, interesting. I have to say the first one that jumps out at me is that Thomas Lane only charged with one of the counts there, and that was failing to render medical aid in the field. The jury there going guilty. I mean, it was a guilty verdict across the board, but Thomas Lane specifically, right, asking a couple of times to perhaps roll over George Floyd. Is he okay? Checking him with Chauvin verbally. And then Thomas Lane, of course, as we've all watched in the body camera footage, gets into the ambulance. Of course, it's too late at that point, but is seen performing CPR or chest compressions on a dying, or at that point dead, George Floyd. And this jury has come back with a guilty verdict against Thomas Lane. That comes quickly to mind. The other one, Tou Thao, never touches George Floyd, obviously has an explanation that he's got to keep an eye on the crowd. He's got to keep an eye on the street, right? That arrest is developing right there along Chicago Avenue at 38th. And he's got his eyes elsewhere, not really fully paying attention to what's going on in Derek Chauvin's knee to George Floyd's neck. He is found guilty on both counts. And, of course, going to J. Alex Kueng, who's in the middle, kind of holding George Floyd's midsection as Derek Chauvin has his knee on George Floyd's neck, a rookie officer, and you know, getting into the racial component here, the mixed race, considered himself black, and you know, had gotten into the police force to be a bridge to the community. He wanted police to be better, and 3 or 4 days into his career, he experiences, or he's part of the George Floyd arrest, and now will presumably spend a whole lot of time in federal prison. I would point out that we've talked a little bit about the criminal state trial that is to come. It's set in June for these same three. I would imagine, though, again, I'm not a lawyer here, but my thoughts here are quickly going to the idea that likely we would start sort of seeing pleas now in the state court and sort of combined global sentences for these three, kind of like how Chauvin did at the reverse order, right? He was found guilty in state court, and now there's a federal deal in place, and that still needs to be sentenced. But my gut now is this would very much put the state trial in court. A federal jury has spoken, and these three men, former police officers with Minneapolis police, all guilty, several counts in depriving George Floyd of his civil rights Memorial Day weekend 2020.
Hey, Paul, I know you've covered these types of trials, and certainly this one, and Derek Chauvin at great length. It does come to mind, and you bring up the very, very valid point moving forward, and that is, how does a trial like this with guilty, you know, with the jury deciding guilty on all of those counts, how does that play forward with the jury? They clearly will know about this. I mean, it's unlikely you can seat a jury that doesn't know that they were convicted in federal trial of these charges. How does that play out now in a criminal trial, as you point out, in June?
Well, you're right, and you know, as I said a moment ago, I would think this would very much change the dynamic here. These three, I mean, I will tell you, I have relationships with their defense attorneys. This will be another shocking verdict for them to take. A moment in time, of course, the George Floyd's murder, so everywhere, omnipresent, the videos, the fact that Chauvin had been convicted already, and these three men absolutely didn't want Derek Chauvin in that courtroom, and they got their wish here, right? He'd pled guilty. He wasn't in there. He was just this, you know, gorilla in the room. Blame him, blame him, blame him for everything. But now this jury is saying, wait a minute, hold on, you three are to blame here as well. Whether, you know, we talked about right before those verdicts came in, the Minneapolis police training. This is very much an indictment on how these officers are clearly being trained, an intervention and not intervening. And, you know, these three bear the brunt of their inaction. We talked about this was a unique sort of case, and that they were being charged and prosecuted for inaction, for not doing something, not getting Derek Chauvin off of them, not doing more to get George Floyd some air. And now they're going away to prison for you know, years. I mean, these I will point out, these counts come with the potential of life sentences. Now that we're not going to go there, Derek Chauvin's plea deal was in the 25-year range, 20 to 25 years. Judge Magnuson still has the sentence there. So you would think they would come in lower than Derek Chauvin just in terms of their roles. But these men will head to prison for a while, and I'm anxious to hear. I don't cover federal courts quite as much as I do state courts, but you know, whether or not they're immediately taken into custody, because remember, these guys for the last, you know, year plus, well, it's almost 2 years now, have been out on bond. We'll see if Judge Magnuson remands them to some type of custody at this point.
Yeah. Paul, let's recap for just a moment for our viewers. I have one more question for you, but let's just recap and talk about the counts again for those who may just be tuning in. We now have the verdicts in for all three of the former Minneapolis police officers who are on trial for violating George Floyd's civil rights. This is a federal case separate from a criminal case, which will get started against them in June. So Tou Thao, one of the former officers, guilty of count 2 and guilty of count 3.
And those are the counts. They read depriving Floyd of his right to medical care and willfully failing to intervene.
And remember, he was the one who was on the sidelines sort of trying to manage the crowd. J. Alexander King, also guilty of count 2 and guilty of count 3.
And then Thomas Lane, he was only charged with count 3, which was depriving Floyd of his right to medical care. He was found guilty as well. Essentially, all charges that were leveled against the three, the jury found them guilty of.
We are waiting for our Rob Olson, who was there at the time as the verdicts were being read. And as he gets into place and we can talk to him, Paul, I have one more question for you. You touched on this just a moment ago. You know, these three former officers really put a lot of blame clearly on Derek Chauvin in that situation. But also, in essence, the MPD was on trial in this case.
Absolutely, and we talked about surfacing during testimony this idea of training on excited delirium. That issue came to the forefront. We realized at City Hall, while Mayor Jacob Fry had said no more training on it, we learned during testimony in the last couple of weeks that excited delirium training was continuing. This idea that perhaps a defendant could, go unconscious and wake up with superhuman strength, and Minneapolis police sort of preparing for that potential, when in the end they were just watching George Floyd die before their eyes. There was no waking up and bouncing out of that state. But you talk about that, you talk about intervention, the militaristic training of MPD, very much on trial here. And again, this jury said, in the end, however you were trained, you did wrong. You deprived George Floyd of his civil rights. This no doubt, obviously, we know it's just kind of reverberating out of St. Paul at the minute, but this will impact communities, policing, training, tactics, habits, intervention in particular, about this militaristic style and not intervening. And these three men likely will have a lot of years in prison to think about it.
All right, Paul, sit tight. Thank you.
All right, as we said earlier, Rob Olson has been following this case from the very beginning. He's been sitting in court. There were no cameras, so we have had his reports throughout our newscast leading into this verdict today. He joins us now from the courthouse. Rob, we got a sense for what the jury's decisions were. We've been through that, but give us a sense for how it went down in the courtroom.
In terms of the verdicts being read here, the only camera that we got to see was the judge himself, Paul Magnuson, on the bench during the course of the trial and testimony. Hearing defense attorney Thomas Plunkett and defense attorney Robert Pauley here walking by me. Earl Gray just walked out probably 30 seconds ago. All of them not stopping to say anything to any of the assembled reporters here. Clearly, not wanting to comment on this after all of them got guilty verdicts for their clients here after a month-long trial here. In the courtroom, though, during the trial, as I was saying, during the testimony, we would see several camera views. You see the judge's bench, you see the attorney, you see the person on the witness stand. You wouldn't see any other views. You didn't see the defendants at the defense table or the prosecution table. Certainly, of course, we don't get to see the jury unless you're in the courtroom, of course. But in this case, for the sentencing, we only saw the judge as he was handed the papers. He looks through them, and then he read them all. After that, then polling the jury one by one, asking them if this was their verdict, and they all said yes, it was. So unanimous verdicts for all 5 counts against the 3 officers. Then he said once the jury left, and he thanked them for their service. This has been a very long trial. And of course, these jurors are not just from this immediate area. They're from the 7-county metro, but then several from outside of that as well, as far away as Jackson County. And this jury selection was 5 weeks ago today. So this has been a long time, a long haul for these jurors, coming, some of them from a pretty good distance. He thanked them for their service. They were brought out of the courtroom, and then he addressed the 3 former officers and the defense attorney, saying that they have to meet with the probation officer sometime within the next week, at which point that begins the pre-sentence investigation to determine the penalties for this, which are wide-ranging. They can be pretty severe, but when you look at the law, at the code here, the penalties there's a broad range of what could be applied in a sentence, all depending on the various factors involved here. So it'd be hard to even narrow down what they might be looking at. The bond, he said, would continue as the current terms are. Their bail, so they're out on bail. They will stay out on bail. They don't see them as a flight risk at this point, and then sentencing will be set once that pre-sentence investigation is complete. So the sentencing date is not on the calendar yet. That all hinges on how long this investigation takes to figure out what that sentence, what the best sentence for that should be.
I wanted to ask you, you've been in court following this day in, day out. Can you help us understand and help the viewers understand at home, what was the threshold here for the prosecution to get these guilty verdicts? I keep seeing this word willfully, and I think that really stands out. Can you break some of that down for us?
Yeah, and that's a key component of these crimes that the jury had to decide the way it's written here, and I've got the language up here right in front of me. So for count 2, where it reads that the defendants willfully failed to intervene to stop defendant Chauvin's use of unreasonable force, and that resulted in the death of George Floyd. So what they had to determine, the judge was very clear in his instructions. This came up obviously in closing arguments from all the attorneys, is that they had to decide and believe that these defendants knew what they were doing was wrong. They knew what they were supposed to be doing, and they knew that they weren't doing that, and they knew that that was the wrong thing to do. So for count 2, which was against Tou Thao and J. Alexander Kueng of failing to intervene, they had to decide that they knew they should intervene, and they willfully decided not to intervene with that use of force. So they had to prove, J. Alexander Kueng said in his testimony, yeah, that is your duty to intervene in unreasonable use of force, but you have to perceive that the force is unreasonable. He's essentially saying that I didn't realize what Derek Chauvin was doing was unreasonable use of force. He said that he had seen Derek Chauvin's knee on the back of George Floyd's neck, although in training you see a lot of that in the pictures that the defense showed to put that reasonable doubt out there, that there's often knees placed near the, not directly on the back of the neck to cut off your airway, but right nearby there. So, you know, J. Alexander Kueng said he saw it there, but then as that event progressed, he never did really get a clear look at it again. So he was arguing, essentially saying that I didn't perceive that as an unreasonable use of force, so therefore how could he willingly not intervene or willfully? But clearly the jury saw it differently.
And Rob, I got to ask you, because I know you noted this in one of your reports, one of the most sort of poignant moments from the prosecution standpoint leads to what you were just talking about there, and that is, if everybody standing on that sidewalk could see that George Floyd was in severe distress, how is it that those other 3 officers, and take Derek Chauvin out of this, those other 3 officers could not see that as well? That would have had, or likely could have had, a profound impact on the jury.
I would agree that that probably had a very profound impact. Certainly it was very profound in the prosecution's presentation of it, and they frequently showed that video, and it was from Tou Thao's body camera. They showed a couple of videos from bystanders that were taken. Of course, we know the video on that circulated so widely on Facebook immediately from Darnella Frazier. But Tou Thao's body camera himself facing those bystanders as he was doing what he characterized as crowd control. The prosecution threw doubt on that there was no control here needed because they didn't seem threatening. They were agitated, they were loud, they were begging and pleading, but they didn't seem hostile. But that there, when they all say, he's not resisting right now, you know, you can stop, take your knee off his neck. He's not resisting anymore. And then that grew into, he's, you know, when he went unconscious, he's not breathing anymore. And then that went into, would you please check his pulse? And then the plea from the off-duty firefighter saying that I can do CPR. You need to start doing chest compressions. So that was a key component of the prosecution's case. That video of the witnesses seeing this and their assertion here that if they could see this and make these observations, certainly the trained officers who are right there should be able to have made the same observations. And if they didn't, these pleas from the bystanders should have alerted them that they should be making these observations, that he may not be breathing anymore. So certainly that had to play a huge role. Video was obviously a very big part of this case with, you know, all the body cameras and the bystander videos. And that is a tough hurdle to cross there, that again, if they could see and identify these exact things these officers were accused of ignoring, how could they have a claim that they weren't ignoring it?
Rob, many of the witnesses here, and you can help us understand this, ran parallel to the witnesses we saw in the criminal trial against Derek Chauvin in the death of George Floyd. Can you talk to us a little bit about some of these witnesses? What stood out to you? Was there anybody different that we hadn't heard from before?
There were some different witnesses, and the one that really stood out to me was the medical expert that the prosecution brought in. Actually, they brought in a couple of medical experts here. I'm going to go try to call up my witness list here that I put together during the course of the trial. I had counted 21 witnesses for the prosecution and 11 for the defense. Dr. Andrew Baker, the Hennepin County medical examiner, was a repeat witness. Obviously, his testimony is important about what he found as the cause of death. But it was Dr. David Sistrom, who's a pulmonary physician at Brigham and Women's Hospital, who came in and testified very similar testimony, actually, to the testimony that came from a medical expert, a pulmonologist in the Derek Chauvin trial. Very convincing and very strong evidence here for the prosecution that George Floyd died of asphyxiation, that it wasn't any of these other events, that clearly you could see in the video, and he analyzed the video much the same way as we saw in the Chauvin trial from the other pulmonologist, analyzing the video where you can see him, what he determines to be the final breaths that he takes, and and these other signs that he was showing that this is oxygen deprivation and what is happening, and some of the results here that show the buildup of carbon dioxide, which is from a lack of oxygen. He was very, very powerful in his testimony to say that this clearly wasn't the result of anything but he literally, when he said he couldn't breathe, he couldn't breathe. He made that statement more than 20 times, and the officers tried to, and their defense attorneys, said that since he had said that before he was even on the ground, when he was in the car, or trying to put them in the car, that they had not taken that seriously. They thought that was potentially just a tactic to avoid restraint. But he said this so many times, and this pulmonologist, this pulmonary physician, was very powerful in saying, nope, it was lack of oxygen, it was from the knee on the neck, and nobody did anything to stop that.
Hey, Rob, I want to ask about the failed defense in this particular case, and the concept that the three officers' deference to Derek Chauvin was literally handcuffing them from, not literally, but figuratively handcuffing them from giving George Floyd the type of help that he would have required. That was a big part of the defense. And to be noted in that would be that two of the officers were literally days on the job.
Yeah, they were J. Alexander Kueng and Thomas Lane. It was J. Alexander Kueng's third shift, and actually his second shift on the street. His first day was Saturday, and he spent it in the precinct. Second day, Sunday. Third day, Monday that day. Thomas Lane was 1 day ahead of him. And, they did try to present this command structure in the MPD, and the defense tried to paint the paramilitary structure of the police department. Obviously, there are some of those elements in a police force, where you wear a uniform and you do drills and there's, you say, sir. Some of that goes with the territory. They were trying to paint that, though, as going beyond that, being one where you are in such, fear of, recrimination from somebody who is a superior officer. The prosecution pointing out here that they were all officers. Derek Chauvin didn't have a higher rank, but the defense brought on, several witnesses that said that realistically, though, the more experienced officers are deferred to as senior officers, as being in command, and they painted Derek Chauvin coming in and taking over. So there were a couple of parallel arguments that they were making with that. One is that, was there a fear of intervening with Derek Chauvin? They danced on that a little bit, that, yeah, there would have been. In the testimony of the three former officers here, now the convicted former officers, they didn't say it explicitly, but they just said, yes, I'm still on probation for a year. They could make a recommendation if they see something they don't like and start the process. But the other track here, in line with that, was not just the fear of recrimination, but it was the respect that they say, especially as rookies a few days out of the street, the respect that they have for the decisions made by those with more experience, especially Derek Chauvin, 19 years in the force, but also a field training officer. So they try to present that as if he's saying, no, we should continue to hold him down, then they didn't feel like that was a choice that they should second guess, because he would know a lot more about them. He's been through many, many years of doing this. We've been through a few days of doing this. So there was two, the fear and the respect.
All right, Rob, we want to let our viewers know we are waiting for comment. And Rob, you may not even know this because you've been talking to us, but Acting U.S. Attorney Charles Kovats and the prosecution team are going to be giving us some comments here shortly. They said about 30 minutes after the verdicts were read, so we're looking at maybe in the next 5 to 10 minutes or so. So we do expect to hear from them. If you've been watching our coverage, you may have noticed the defense team did walk right past all of the reporters, not stopping to issue any sort of comment at this time. So let's bring our viewers back up to speed here, where we're at this moment.
Again, this was the federal trial denying George Floyd his civil rights. One of those rights was the denial of medical care during the incident in which he was killed there on the street in Minneapolis. Derek Chauvin, as we all know, was convicted of that, the former Minneapolis police officer. He now is in jail or prison for that charge. But these three officers were there with him at the time, and they all had roles in that event. One's role, Tou Thao's role, was to hold the crowd back, to keep the area safe for bystanders, traffic, and the other officers. And then J. Alexander King was closest to Derek Chauvin on George Floyd's body. He was in the middle, holding George Floyd down, and Thomas Lane was in the back toward the feet of George Floyd. And Thomas Lane was only charged with one of the two counts, and that was the count that he was convicted on, depriving George Floyd of his right to medical care. He was guilty on that. The other two guilty of both charges. Again, this is the civil trial. It's federally conducted. The jury found all three officers guilty of all charges that they were leveled upon them.
There have been roughly 18 days of testimony. Jury selection was actually 5 weeks ago today. If you remember in the beginning, Judge Paul Magnuson had said he wanted to keep this trial moving at a fairly swift pace because of all of the possibilities out there, right? We're in the middle of COVID right now. He was concerned that there may be some other disruptions, and I don't know if Rob is still there, but Rob, we did have a couple of sort of hiccups along the way as this trial went on, but for the most part, things did run according to plan.
It did run for the most part according to plan. Yeah, the jury selection was 5 weeks ago today. They did it all in a day. The judge was very, very concerned about keeping this moving. This went longer than he would have liked. He was saying, maybe trying to get this done in under 4 weeks. But again, jury selection was done in a day by the judge. It was done very efficiently, I guess I would say, in which they brought in the jurors and he looked at the questionnaires. He didn't give the attorneys a chance to question each potential juror, as we've seen perhaps if you watch the Derek Chauvin trial. That is a pretty common thing where the attorneys get a chance to ask questions. That jury selection stretched on for a while. The judge wanted to keep this quick. He handled all of that himself with each potential juror, prospective jurors. And then once they got a big enough pool, then the attorneys were able to do strikes. And that was it. And that's how we got that done in a day. The opening statements came the following Monday. So he did move this along quickly. The couple of hiccups in the case were when Thomas Lane tested positive for COVID-19. That came on a Wednesday morning. So everyone was in court. The attorneys were all there. Two of the defendants. Thomas Lane was not initially. And then the message came because he had just tested positive, I believe, here at the courthouse. I guess I never got that clarified, but were doing and had tests available here at the courthouse as well. So then the trial had to take 3 days off. Of course, we had last Friday off because Attorney Earl Gray had to be at the Kim Potter sentencing. Couldn't be in both at once, obviously. So the judge then held court on Monday, a federal holiday, to make up for that day to try to keep it moving. There were many times during the course of the testimony where he repeatedly sort of scolded the prosecutors for taking too long. There were many objections from defense attorneys that the questioning was repetitive, and the judge sustained them and then would say, yes, counsel, you've been over this. We've heard this 3 or 4 times already. Move on. And, you wonder, does that have an impact on the jury? They're hearing the federal judge scolding, and this happened almost every day, the prosecution for being slow and repetitive and going over the same ground and taking too long. I guess foundational objections and cumulative objections, all these things, and essentially we're saying the same thing. You're going over the same thing over and over. He wanted to keep it sped up. That did, obviously, the jury found guilt, so that didn't weigh into their decision making. Apparently not. I mean, but you wonder how that impacts a juror as they're watching that.
Yeah, and just to recap, 13 hours of deliberation until the jury came back with those verdicts. Rob, hang on there. We're gonna come back to you in just a few minutes, but I do want to bring Paul Bloom back into this. Paul, it occurs to me that we have a different sort of bird's eye view of all of this because the murder of George Floyd happened in our city, and you covered that long and well, just like everybody else did in this city. But if we look at these verdicts, Derek Chauvin guilty, these 3 officers now guilty in the federal trial. There is a far-reaching message here outside of the bounds of Minnesota, outside the bounds of the Twin Cities, when these type of verdicts come in, if you factor in the cry all around the country for police reform.
Absolutely. This case is being watched, discussed all across the country. Obviously, huge news developing globally today, but the state court trial was live TV cameras. Everybody watched that. They saw Derek Chauvin found guilty of murder today. The idea that the other officers at the scene, I know these attorneys thought they had good cases. They thought in terms of criminal negligence there. I know they went into this case with confidence, and to have this jury, and again, I think it's important to point out because we talk about perhaps it's Twin Cities juries that are really concerned about the policing and the tactics specifically within the Minneapolis Police Department. Of course, weeks earlier we just had Kim Potter, Brooklyn Center, found guilty by a jury, and then a judge going lower at sentencing. She had the final say there. Obviously, Judge Magnuson will have a say here when he sentences these 3. I thought it was interesting. We talked about in advance of the verdict whether or not they would be remanded to custody. Judge Magnuson here is going to allow them to stay out, let the pre-sentencing investigation take shape, and then he will sentence them at some point, trusting them that they are not flight risks, that they will return to court. Remember, Judge Chu immediately remanded Kim Potter right before Christmas, despite her defense pleas, including defense attorney Earl Gray. So Earl Gray has lost 2 extremely high-profile trials back-to-back here, representing police officers and their conduct. And again, reiterating that this jury is not just Twin Cities jury that looked at the inactions of these officers at the scene that day, but included several jurors from outstate as well. So interesting. Now, I do want to point out there's some awkwardness here in that Rob Olson was able to watch inside the courthouse, a video feed, but there were actually a couple reporters, we call them pool reporters, that were in the courtroom, and we're getting some color from the courtroom for the first time this afternoon after these guilty verdicts were filed. I would note in the notes here, interesting, the court only gave everybody 15 minutes to get there once a verdict was reached. So very few people, it notes, are in the gallery. Maybe a family member of Tou Thao is in there, maybe one loved one of George Floyd, but it seemed like a pretty empty courtroom. Again, Rob was only able to see the judge because of the video feed. It sounds like Thomas Lane either dropped or tossed something on the table, leaned back in his chair after being found guilty by this jury, heads shaken. Earl Gray looks at Lane. Lane looks back at his attorney, Earl Gray. They shake their heads at each other. Juror 30 crying as the verdict is presented, as the judge reads this verdict in court. Some emotion there, and then no reaction from Kueng and Thao as they process the verdict, at least from the eyes of our pool reporters who were inside that courtroom this afternoon. The verdict's coming down around 4:08 p.m. Time stamped here, according to the pool notes. So just some color from that courtroom. And interesting to point out here, you've talked to Rob about we are awaiting the U.S. Attorney's Office, the prosecution team. This is a team we don't know. This was done, again, without cameras. This is not Jerry Blackwell and Steve Schlischer, a couple of faces who sort of became almost famous in the way they prosecuted Derek Chauvin in state court. So the prosecution's team will be new to us as we see them come up to the podium. I would just also point out, just out of interest, as someone who's covered this case straight through, remember George Floyd was killed at a time when Donald Trump was in the White House, and it was a Republican Department of Justice. It has now swung to a Democratic Department of Justice. Again, the law not political, but certainly the people making the top decisions are. And right now we are in sort of a leadership vacuum at the U.S. Attorney's Office. There's some movement. The acting U.S. Attorney now at this point, not saying it's rudderless, but it's a dynamic time for this office as they sort of have prosecuted this case and have won verdicts. There was a question, could they do it? And they have certainly done that, holding Tou Thao, J. Alexander Kueng, and Thomas Lane accountable and responsible for depriving George Floyd of his civil rights. And remember, we talked about the rookie officers and deferring to Derek Chauvin in the moment, but do remember that it was Thomas Lane and J. Alexander Kueng who were the first arriving officers and had that first encounter with George Floyd. And I remember clearly Thomas Lane going up to that car. Remember, we were talking about a $20 counterfeit bill. This is all what that comes back to, and with the gun drawn and sort of how that began the tragic events that would unfold at 38th in Chicago. And at one point there, also had him handcuffed, right, on the sidewalk, sitting down, but they really wanted to attempt to get him into that squad car, and George Floyd getting more and more agitated at that point and fighting that, citing claustrophobia and the like. So again, those rookie officers, while not with the knee to the neck, did begin the encounter and had those early encounters with George Floyd before Chauvin took Floyd to the ground and kneeled on him for 9.5 minutes. All
right, Paul, appreciate it. Stay with us. More to come, as he pointed out before, and you pointed out the U.S. Attorney, the prosecution team is expected to get before a mic here in the next few minutes, and we certainly want to hear that as well.
We didn't hear anything from the defense team. They walked past the pool of reporters and did not stop. We don't know if we'll be hearing anything later from them. I want to go back now to Rob Olson, if he's available. Rob, I'm curious here, in closing arguments, the last thing that these jurors would have heard, were there any moments or mantras that sort of stuck out at you, the last impression that would have been left with these jurors?
Well, the last impressions really, the defense continued to make their attacks on Minneapolis police training. And, I thought they presented a good case there to really put out that doubt there, which they said that these defendants were doing as they were trained to hold somebody down until an ambulance gets there in a case of suspected excited delirium. We know after the fact, in hindsight, George Floyd was not in a state of excited delirium. The levels of narcotics in his body, as the autopsy showed, were nowhere near the level that would lead to that. But the defense attorneys, put that out there, that this is what they were trained to do in those cases if they suspected it, and they all three suspected it. But the moment here again at the end with the prosecution, which they went over in such detail everything. But again, that thing that we talked about a little bit earlier about when they said that it was clear to all the bystanders on the scene that a man was slowly dying right before their eyes, and that is a pretty powerful thing to say and a thing to put in, to bring to jurors, which obviously they'd seen all the video and they could watch it again. There was an IT person on hand so that they could view any of these videos and electronic evidence again as much as they wanted to. But that is something that clearly is kind of hard to get past, that idea of those bystanders calling out things, untrained bystanders, teenagers, some of them, calling out some of those things. And I thought that was potentially the most powerful statement in the closing of the prosecution, which took an hour and 40 minutes. That's what really stood out to me.
On the defense side, Rob, it occurs to us and those that have watched this, you included in that, that when a defense team decides to use the defense that these officers were just doing their jobs, or they were doing their jobs as they were trained, is really, at least in the most recent cases here in the Twin Cities, is no longer a plausible defense when it gets before a jury.
And I think that's true. I think people are really taking that differently, you know, because is that being used as simply a scapegoat? Is that an umbrella that we can get under and free us up from any responsibilities? That certainly is a question that's going through a lot of people, and certainly a question of does, you know, training is something that needs to be addressed. Now, the prosecution very, very clearly and thoroughly made the case that these officers did not do as they were trained, that they were clearly trained once somebody is restrained to put them onto a side recovery position so that they can breathe, that they've been trained about the dangers of positional asphyxia, which is what happened here. When you're face down, your lungs can't expand when you're like that, and then you add weight on your back and then on your neck. That the officers had been trained that people can die this way, that they clearly were trained for this. Again, the defense saying saying the training was inadequate, the duty to intervene was a slide in a slide deck that was barely covered. But yeah, a lot of this is, you know, if you're blaming the training, the prosecution saying, that, well, some of these things are common sense. And that's what they told the jurors too in the midst of that closing yesterday, or a couple days ago. That was very powerful too. You know, for all the complications of this, all the witnesses and testimony for a month, and their hour and 40-minute closing argument, then they said something else. The prosecutor, Amanda Surdich, an assistant U.S. attorney, said, all you need for this is two things: the video and your common sense. And I think that was, too, another pretty powerful thing there, that they said that, you know, you can attack the training all you want, but common sense should prevail.
Rob, you were not in the courtroom for most of this. You had a very limited view. I believe you said you could see the seal and maybe the judge at times. Can you tell us anything else about who may have been in that courtroom, or do you know? Were there any family members or supporters of any of the parties?
Yeah, I was in the courtroom for a few days, and you know, it would vary. There were some consistent people in the gallery for both sides. I know there was a distant relative of George Floyd. I think it was a second cousin of George Floyd's mother that was here pretty routinely. There were family members of, you know, Thomas Lane's wife was in the gallery quite often as well. There were some relatives of Tou Thao and J. Alexander Kueng that would be in there. But again, a small crowd in the courtroom. They limited, you know, the judge very much had COVID-19 concerns here, which is why the jury had plexiglass dividers, and they limited who could be in there. That's why it's pool reporters. You know, there'd be a handful of reporters in there sharing notes, with the rest watching on the closed circuit. So it was a small number of people. From the pool notes today, it just notes that it was George Floyd's mother's cousin who was in there, and on the defense side, it appeared to be one woman that they made note of. So not a big crowd in there today for this, but throughout though it's been pretty sparse in there. Just a few family members that have been able to get in there, and certainly not every day. Courtney Ross, George Floyd's girlfriend, was in there most days, or parts of most days. We saw her here very, very frequently, taking in as much of this as she could.
All right, Rob, appreciate that. Again, just to bring our viewers, as we get a little bit closer to the 5 o'clock hour, we will run our 5 o'clock news at that hour. But in the meantime, we want to keep you up to date on what's actually happening. The jury came back in the federal trial for the 3 former Minneapolis police officers charged with denying George Floyd his civil rights on that day back on Memorial Day weekend of 2020 when he was murdered there on the street in Minneapolis. Derek Chauvin, of course, was convicted in the criminal phase of that. He is in federal prison now, or in prison now. These 3 officers convicted of essentially willfully denying George Floyd medical care at the time that incident was occurring, and all 3 officers were convicted on all of the charges that were leveled against them.
That's right. 18 days of testimony. This trial, we've talked about how the pacing was pretty efficient, is the word that Rob Olson used. 5 weeks ago today is when the deliberations started. We are currently waiting to hear from the acting U.S. Attorney, Charles Kovats, and his prosecution team. We expect that will be happening any moment now. As Randy said, we will begin our 5 o'clock news here in just a few minutes as well. You've been hearing from Rob Olson, who's been covering this every day, spent a couple of days in the actual courtroom as the pool reporter, otherwise has been watching it from the sidelines and bringing us up to speed every day. And then our Paul Bloom also giving us some analysis, as this trial, while different, it is a civil trial in federal court, really in some ways ran parallel to the criminal trial for Derek Chauvin, in that many of the witnesses were the same. And
because it's a federal trial, Paul, and I know you're there, it has far more far-reaching sort of tentacles than a state criminal trial. So when you have a federal trial like this, I mean, not that everybody's not watching what's going on here, but this certainly can be precedent setting. It can result in changes all around the country if you look at how the defense tried to use the defense of these were subordinate officers. They only did what they were trained to do. And it sort of plays into the argument that has been going on in this country since the death of George Floyd, that police training is highly inadequate. It isn't meeting today's needs, and that it needs to change in virtually every city in the country. So this will be looked at from that perspective. And that's probably the biggest part of this verdict today.
Again, maybe we can recap for our viewers who may be watching at home. Maybe Paul is ready. Paul,
I would just add,
Paul.
I would just obviously Randy's talking about the federal nature, the implications beyond. I would just point out, we just got a bulletin from the civil attorney for the Floyd family, Ben Crump, who's obviously become a familiar face across this country, representing victims, particularly victims of color, involved in police homicide, police brutality cases. He's out with an early statement. I just thought maybe I would read it. I'm hearing now behind me that they're setting up the podium, so we should hear any minute now from the U.S. Attorney's Office. But just a quick comment, again, Ben Crump weighing in on this verdict today, closing another important chapter in our journey for justice for George Floyd and his family. These officers tried to devise any excuse that could let them wash the blood from their hands. But following these verdicts, George's blood will forever stain them. Today's guilty verdict should serve as the guiding example of why police departments across America should expand and prioritize instruction on an officer's duty to intervene and recognize when a fellow officer is using excessive force. Again, that's just half of this statement from Ben Crump, the legal team representing George Floyd's family. Of course, they winning a record settlement with the city of Minneapolis last year. During Derek Chauvin's jury selection, you may remember when that massive reward was announced. The reward was announced because of George Floyd's murder. But again, Ben Crump, a nationally recognized civil rights attorney, he's been in town recently talking about no-knock warrants, but clearly now here his big message coming out of this trial, really underlining the idea of intervention and how police departments are trained. One person's opinion. I know there are differing opinions about Ben Crump out there, but again, the legal team there beginning with the discussion here coming out of this federal trial, this duty to intervene and how our officers are trained. If you see something wrong, do you have an obligation to act and do something to stop that? Clearly, this jury of this federal trial in St. Paul said, yes, these officers had a duty to do something more than just a cursory, hey, should we roll him over? Is he okay? And checking a pulse. This jury said today, you need to intervene, you need to do something, you need to provide medical aid to someone who is dying, who is gasping for breath, and eventually goes breathless. And these officers did not do that. They did not get involved. They did not provide medical care until it was too late, once Thomas Lane got into that ambulance and began chest compressions. And today we saw guilty verdicts up and down, 5 total counts, King, Lane, Thao, guilty across the board.
All right, Paul, we want to bring in my colleague Kelsey Carlson now, as we are going to be starting the 5 o'clock news here shortly. We are in continuing coverage, though. We are covering the verdicts that have just come down here in the last hour, 45 minutes or so, in the federal civil trial of 3 former Minneapolis police officers who were charged with violating George Floyd's civil rights.
It's a criminal trial in federal court over civil rights, and whether or not they failed to intervene or offer medical care, and all found guilty on the counts that they were facing today.
They were charged with depriving George Floyd of his right to medical care, as Kelsey said, when the most senior officer on that scene, Derek Chauvin, pressed his knee into George Floyd's neck, as we know, for 9.5 minutes as George Floyd died.
And I think, the question moving forward is the ripple effect across the country for police officers and what this means for training, and the fact that you will have to step in. Doesn't matter if it's a senior officer, you will have to step in if something is happening that is not right. This case today says you have to intervene, and it will be interesting to watch police training locally and across the country as a result of these cases and what's been happening in Minnesota.
We are currently waiting for acting U.S. Attorney Charles Kovats and his prosecution team to give us a comment here any moment. We are in continuing coverage as the verdicts have come in now for the 3 former Minneapolis police officers charged with violating George Floyd's civil rights.
All right, and we are beginning our 5 o'clock news today with breaking news. Verdicts in the federal trial for J. Alexander King, Tou Thao, and Thomas Lane, the Minneapolis police officers on trial for violating the civil rights of George Floyd. This is a trial that we had to play out in pictures because no cameras are allowed in federal courtrooms. So all you see are the notes from the pool reporters in the courtroom and also sketches that come out daily. And there you see Tou Thao, J. Alexander King in the middle, and then Thomas Lane, all found guilty on the charges that they were facing. Tou Thao, J. Alexander King, charged with not intervening, not stopping Derek Chauvin that day, and Thomas Lane, all 3 charged with not intervening to provide medical care. All 3 found guilty on the charges that they were facing.
Oh, as Kelsey mentioned, what we saw were courtroom sketches, and we did not have cameras in the courtroom. What the jurors saw and heard was the video. Rob, I want to go back to you now. We know how impactful that video was in the criminal trial of Derek Chauvin. Talk to us a little bit about the impact that this had in this trial in federal court.
Yeah, and certainly an enormous amount of video evidence in this case. You have the body camera videos from the officers there. You've got bystander videos, and there was a video as well from a city camera across the street from the scene that they used a lot. The judge was being very careful not to show too much of the video. Said the jurors need to see it all, but he didn't want it repeatedly played for the jurors because it's difficult to watch, and he didn't want them to have to be subjected to the same thing over and over again. In other parts of the testimony then, to make various points on questioning, especially with the 3 defendants, they would play, short clips, 10 seconds or so, and they would often take still frames from videos too to bring up to make their point of the questions that they were asking. But certainly that video played a major role, and that's what the prosecution said in their closing statements, that you really just need your common sense and to look at the videos, and that will tell you everything that you need to know. One of the most impactful videos that you saw is not only, you see the viewpoints of the officers accused, but particularly the viewpoint of Tou Thao, who was standing next to the squad car on the street there. He termed it as crowd control. He never once touched George Floyd during this entire encounter. He arrived there with Derek Chauvin, and while Derek Chauvin basically took control of the situation there, Tou Thao stood and kept the onlookers back. When they'd come onto the street, he would tell them to get back on the sidewalk. But that video was probably the most powerful thing here, where it shows you very clearly that the bystanders were raising these objections, these concerns, begging, pleading. He's not breathing. You can take your knee off his neck. Would you check his pulse? Is it just they grew louder and louder as this went on? Certainly, that was very powerful video for these jurors to see in the midst of their testimony. 4 weeks of testimony here, and videos were very much a big part of it. But again, the judge very careful not to over-inundate the jury with those videos, although they could watch any of them that they wanted to during their deliberations to once again refer to it. We're a couple minutes away here from the acting U.S. attorney taking the podium. That's just to my left, behind me a little bit. They're walking up, but it's going to be a couple of seconds here. I will tell you that this jury got the case just before 10 o'clock yesterday morning. They deliberated till shortly after 5, resumed at 9 today. They went from 9 to noon and then 12:30 until 3:45 when we got the word that the verdicts had come in. Read about 5 to 10 after 4, guilty on 5 counts against the 3 officers. I am now going to, well, but they're not quite ready yet, so I'll just keep talking. So these 12 jurors, which were 4 men and 8 women, coming from a cross-section of counties here from the metropolitan area, one as far away as Jackson County. Here now the acting U.S. attorney.
Across the board, guilty verdict. Right now, prosecutors from the U.S. Attorney's Office are approaching the podium this week. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Charles Govats. I'm the acting United States Attorney for the District of Minnesota, and I'm joined today by the prosecution team, Assistant United States Attorneys Alan Slaughter, Amanda Surdich, Leanne Bell, Evan Gilead, DOJ Trial Attorney Samantha Treppel, Trial Attorney Tara Allison, Paralegal Steph Braun, Henry Frank, Victim Witness Specialist Selena Colesrud, and Christina Bussi, and FBI Special Agent Blake Hostetter. I'm also here with FBI Special Agent in Charge Michael Paul. On behalf of the trial team, the United States Attorney's Office, and the Department of Justice, I want to thank the jury for their service over the past several weeks. May 25th, 2020 represents an inflection point in our community. On that day, a man tragically and senselessly lost his life at the hands of law enforcement. It was a scene that will forever be seared into our memories. George Floyd, handcuffed and pinned to the ground by 3 officers, while a 4th, Officer Tou Thao, stood nearby. Officers Lane and King were positioned on Mr. Floyd's back and legs, and Officer Derek Chauvin held his knee on Mr. Floyd's neck. He was held down for more than 9 minutes. Mr. Floyd called out more than 20 times that he couldn't breathe, repeatedly begging to be let up. Eventually, he stopped begging. He stopped breathing. His pulse stopped. He lost consciousness. He became motionless. All the while, these officers chose to do nothing to assist Mr. Floyd as he lay dying. And the world collectively witnessed this tragic and horrifying loss of life and humanity. Today, former officers Thao, Kueng, and Lane stand convicted by a jury of their peers for willfully violating Mr. Floyd's civil rights, the same rights guaranteed to all of us by the United States Constitution. These officers had a moral responsibility, a legal obligation, and a duty to intervene. And by failing to do so, they committed a crime. This is a reminder that all sworn law enforcement officers, regardless of rank or seniority, individually and independently, have a duty to intervene and provide medical aid to those in their custody. It's a fundamental duty of policing. It's good policing. In their custody is in their care. And it's a duty followed every day by police officers in communities around the United States, often under very difficult circumstances. Officers Thao, Kueng, and Lane on that day failed to fulfill this duty, and as a result, George Floyd senselessly died. That is why they were charged. That is why they were convicted. And although today's verdict won't bring George Floyd back to his family or his friends, his community, and his loved ones, this outcome represents our collective affirmation to uphold George Floyd's civil rights, again, the same ones afforded to all of us under the Constitution. My pride for the work done by this team and by my office and the department as a whole is immense. This trial presented numerous challenges and hurdles, all of which this team met and surpassed with tenacity and determination and grace and grit. It was a distinct honor and privilege to try this case. Finally, and importantly, I want to thank the Floyd family and his loved ones for their patience and cooperation for the past 2 years. Their strength is admirable. I'm going to be followed here at the lectern by FBI Special Agent in Charge, Michael Paul. SAC Paul.
Thank you, Charlie. Again, my name is Michael Paul. I'm the Special Agent in Charge of the FBI's Minneapolis Field Office, which serves Minnesota and North and South Dakota. I want to start by echoing the comments of our acting U.S. Attorney and acknowledging the service of the prosecutive and investigative teams in this case. Their work from the very get-go on the tragic day that this began was prompt and swift. It was collaborative, not only between investigators and prosecutors, but also with our partners here in the state of Minnesota, and it established an important standard for us for swift investigative action in these types of matters. I also want to thank the work of the jury and their discerning ear, their diligence, and really their fortitude in bringing forth a very important verdict for our country. From the very beginning, the case had great potential to help inform an ongoing debate across our country about law enforcement. And today, their work, their diligence again, and their verdict helps us reaffirm a very important standard for all of law enforcement across America. The FBI takes very seriously our civil rights investigative responsibilities. It's one of the most unique investigative jurisdictions and one of the most important programs that we work. These cases are very important for defending the rights of our citizens, and it's important for us to remember the consequences of these types of incidents as we go forward. And this case, again, has established a very important benchmark for all law enforcement officers, agents, deputies at all levels of law enforcement across America. That we are responsible, we are professionally accountable for our actions and caring for those that are in our custody and protecting United States citizens, even those that have broken the law. And so again, my great thanks and appreciation for all the portions of the justice system that worked collaboratively and in a timely manner on this case in order to make sure that justice was done. And the FBI remains committed in the future to work these types of matters with our partners. And we're so lucky and so proud to have the collaborative relationships that we have in the state of Minnesota to work on these matters when warranted. Thank you.
All right, thank you. I'd like to invite Assistant United States Attorney Leanne Bell to come to the lectern and talk about the case from the trial team's perspective.
Good afternoon. My name is Leanne Bell. I'm an Assistant United States Attorney for the District of Minnesota, and a proud one today. On behalf of the team, we want to say thank you to all of those who supported this prosecution. We haven't been able to talk about George Floyd much during this trial, but as one of the brave bystanders said, George Floyd was a human being. He deserved to be treated as such. He was a son, a father, a significant other, a family member, and a friend to so many. His family endured so much to get here. And we want to thank the Floyd family for their patience and cooperation during the course of this investigation and prosecution. My hope, the hope of our team, is that today's verdict will bring a measure of justice. We also want to say thank you to the jury for diligently listening to this trial and through it all, hearing his voice. This trial has been long and challenging for many reasons, but this jury carried out their civil service with attentiveness and earnestness, and we thank them for their service. We would also like to express deep gratitude for those witnesses who testified at this trial. To those brave bystanders, especially, we say thank you. You showed so much courage that evening and through multiple trials. You knew what was right, and you said it out loud. Last, to the FBI for their support. We could not have done this case without our law enforcement partners and all of the officers that act with courage and compassion to uphold the Constitution every day. Thank you.
And you may be seeing George Floyd's family coming out to address the public as well in just a moment, but you've been listening to the U.S. Attorney's Office talk about the prosecution of these 3 former Minneapolis police officers who were involved in George Floyd's arrest on May 25th of 2020 and charged with violating his civil rights, found guilty today of failing to intervene and provide medical assistance.
We have now members of George Floyd's family here who would like to say a few words, and I'll start by introducing Felonious Floyd. Mr. Floyd.
How y'all doing? I'm Felonious Floyd, brother of George Floyd. And I have my nephew with me, Brandon Williams, who George raised like a son. Today is a good day for us. That this is the first time that I ever seen something like this did. 4 white officers were convicted of killing an African-American man. I know a lot of people have been texting me back and forth. I'm grateful for what all these attorneys did today. And, you know, they my friends, you know, because they did a hell of a job. And after just watching what happened to Kim Potter, I was like, I'm still going to believe and I have faith, because I just wanted some time to be served from somebody for what happened to my brother. This is just accountability. It can never be justice, because I can never get George back. And no matter how many times that I pray at night and I think about my brother 24/7, it still is going to be hard, even though we just had a federal conviction and we already had the state conviction. But times, you know, will be probably a lot harder for me still, because I can't get my brother back. And at the same time, I hope that Congress, the Senate, whoever it is, they're looking at what's going on, because if people are being transparent and they're also speaking out and the jury said guilty, 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 then up there in Congress, they ought to go ahead and say, let's pass this George Floyd Justice Policing Act to be able to help people of color be able to understand that they can move around and understand that they won't be murdered on sight. We need to end the qualified immunity. We need to end the no-knock warrants. We need to make sure there's no more chokeholds and make sure all these police officers have their gear on, dash gear, body gear, all of it. Also, we need to start a registry for these officers to make sure that they can't leave from Minneapolis to get to Wisconsin and get a job there after you do something bad. So this is unfortunately a bad time, but it's also a good time. Like I said earlier, you come to some places and they might be wrong, but you're there for the right reasons. You know what I mean? So I just thank everybody who helped us out with this case, and I don't know how to act right now because I'm getting emotional. I got a lot of stuff going through my head. This has been a journey, and this has been over 2 years of the same stuff, back and forth, back and forth. But I just thank everybody for coming out. I'm going to thank these lawyers so much because, you know, without them, we wouldn't even be able to stand at this podium right now just to be able to speak about what happened. So Benjamin Crump, I'd like to give him some credit. I'd like to give Keith Ellison some credit. Just so many people who had their hands in this case, and they just made it better for people. And I'm starting to feel like I can breathe again, but I just need you all to tell Congress to please read this. Don't let this tragedy hit your front door before you make a decision. Pass the law. Pass the George Floyd Policing Act. Thank y'all.
I'm Brandon Williams, the nephew of George Floyd. And I'd like to start by saying God is good. And I want to send a huge thank you to everybody that's standing back here. You know, throughout the trial, they constantly checked on us and made sure that we were okay. And a special thanks to Miss Selena.
Miss Selena.
You know, you were great, and we appreciate everything. She made it a lot easier for us to be here because, you know, we've been here so many times since May 25th of 2020, and these visitors aren't happy. And, you know, she did everything, and she was so great to comfort us and make this a lot easier because it's hard. You know, it's a lot of sleepless nights. It's a lot of sad nights, holidays, birthdays, and you just wish George was here because, you know, he was so family-oriented, and we miss him a lot. And, you know, it's even worse because he was murdered. He didn't die of natural causes, and he should still be here. You know, this day is historic because just not too long ago, you know, the murders of Ahmaud Arbery, you know, were sentenced, found guilty in federal hate crimes as well. And, you know, that's like 2 in the same week or maybe the same month. I don't know the exact date. And, you know, that's historic for this country because oftentimes, you know, officers kill black and brown men and women, and we get little to no consequences. A lot of times we don't even get charges, let alone a conviction. You know, so we'll take this small victory, you know, and smile about it and be happy, but deep down we're still hurting. You know, we want this to stop. You know, this means so much to us because we've connected with so many families, you know, that's in similar situations and received no justice. And, you know, I'm shaking because my first trip here, the first press conference I did, I said that we're only coming here to get some justice and accountability. You know, and today was another step towards that. And you know, it feels good. You know, we were very optimistic today, and when they said that the verdict, that the jury were deliberating because we saw what happened in the Kim Powder sentencing. You know, there's no way that an unarmed black man supposedly accidentally killed and the cop is only sentenced to 18 months. You know, I found that very disrespectful and hurtful because, you know, I've connected with Dante Wright's family, and I just felt for him so bad because I know what Dante meant to Miss Katie and Mr. Arbery. So we were very optimistic and nervous pending the outcome of this verdict. So hopefully this is a step in the right direction for people that's in power to do the right thing, you know, to change laws and policies, you know, that's going to protect people from these situations. You know, and more than anything, that's going to hold them accountable and sends a message that says if you murder or use excessive or deadly force, it's consequences that follow.
Yes.
I think when you make a statement by convicting these officers, you know, they start to feel like, hey, maybe I shouldn't do it. I can't get away with it. Because in the past, they've gotten away with it so much. So all in all, I'd just like to say thank you to everybody that played a role in this. You know, thank you to family, friends, the people that don't know us, the media, everybody that got out and protested, that just sent prayers. You know, we really appreciate it because when these cameras go away, our pain don't. So thank y'all.
Yeah. And also, if they can make federal laws to protect the bird, then they could make federal laws to protect people of color. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Mr. Kovacs, what kind of sentencing will you recommend for these defendants?
Well, we're not doing questions, but thank you. We'll do that in due course. Thank you.
Yep.
Okay, we've been listening to Acting U.S. Attorney Charles Kovacs and his prosecution team, and also family members of George Floyd reacting to 5 guilty verdicts in the federal trial of these 3 former Minneapolis police officers who are now found guilty of violating George Floyd's civil rights.
And you hear the attorneys talk about the process of this trial, this 4-week-long trial, and what they had to go through to bring this case to trial, and the gratitude that they expressed today, and then reiterating the facts of this case. Remember, this is a case that we didn't get to watch, like we were able to watch Derek Chauvin's trial with continuous coverage. Federal court does not allow cameras, so you're getting updates through, in the public eye, sketches and notes every day. And Charles Kovacs just reminding the public what this was about. George Floyd sitting there begging, calling out, pleading more than 20 times that he could not breathe, sitting there under Derek Chauvin's knee for 9 minutes. Finally, he stopped begging and became motionless, and he said these officers who were on trial did nothing. And then you hear George Floyd's brother come up, Flonies, who we've heard numerous times address the public, just expressing extreme gratitude for the prosecution team. And these are not happy trips, he and his nephew said, as they come to Minnesota, as they have so many times in the last 2 years, to talk about this case, but that everybody around them has created such a level of comfort for them every time they do come into town and have to relive this case again and again.
Yeah, we heard from Leanne Bell, the U.S. District Attorney, as well, who talked about the fact that they didn't get to talk about George Floyd during this particular trial, much other than the obvious with the video and the charges against the 3 former officers. So hearing from his family was interesting, talking about that it's a good day for them, and they really talked about moving forward what they want as far as passing the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. We have our Rob Olson, who was there as this news conference was happening. We're going to check back in with him here in just a few moments. We're also going to continue on with Fox 9 News at 5, bring you some of the other day's headlines as well, so stay with us.